Good morning. My name is Sarah Serafini, and I'm the Suncoast Student Production Awards co-chair. Before we begin today's webinar, I want to just remind everybody of a couple of important dates coming up. The deadline for the Suncoast Student Production Awards call for entries is March 1st, which is quickly approaching. The deadline for the Suncoast Chapter scholarship application is March 12th, and this year we are really excited to be granting up to $100,000 in scholarships. So for more information, please go to our website, suncoastchapter.org. For today's webinar, I want to remind everybody that questions should include your full name, school, and your complete question. And now, without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to our moderator and panelist, Ana Cuervo.
Good morning. I'm Ana Cuervo with Telemundo 51, sister station to NBC6, and I'm so honored to be here. First of all, because I have a great deal of respect for student journalists. I got to know your work very closely during my son's amazing journey at CCNN at Christopher Columbus High School, and I got to follow he and his friends as they continued their incredible work as journalists during their college years. Now, after almost 20 years at the station, I was assigned to the political beat, covering local and state politics, and specifically issues that really affect the community. 5 years later, I was feeling pretty comfortable and content covering county and city commission meetings, talking to neighbors and local leaders. I got to know the state capitol in Tallahassee pretty well, traveled there a few times during the legislative session, had the cell phones of all the legislators. There was not an issue that I could not handle, not a story that I could not completely tackle. And then 2020 happened. I never imagined our lives could change so quickly, both personally and professionally, and that we would be challenged as journalists in so many different ways. In the beginning of the pandemic, I had a renewed sense of the critical importance of local news. Every single day, we were offering vital information on a threat that was new to all of us. And then during the racial protests in the summer, as a reporter for a Spanish language station, I took on the challenge to go to local leaders in the African American community, not to look for the same Spanish interviews as always, but I wanted to go to them to help explain to my audience the real pain behind those protests. But if I'm going to be honest, one of the most difficult challenges after reporting for Telemundo for so many years was the electoral season. We Hispanics have that warmth about us where people have stopped me. Ana Cuervo, you're in my living room every evening. Anita, we love you. And then all of a sudden, towards the end of a year of working so hard, we, the media, became the enemy to a lot of those same people. But we'll have plenty of time to talk about all of that because what this webinar is about giving our best reputable reporting during all those tough times. And we have a great panel to discuss this. And I want to introduce our first panelist, Christian de la Rosa from WPLG Local 10.
Hello. Hi. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for the introduction. As Ana Cuervo said, I'm Christian de la Rosa. I am a reporter for Local 10 News, the ABC News affiliate in Miami. I've been reporting since 2007. I've had the pleasure of working in small town Panama City Beach, in Orlando, in San Diego, LA, in Tijuana, Mexico, in Atlanta, and most recently here in Miami. For the past 4 years. And as Anna said, to say 2020 has been a challenge is an understatement. To say it's been a learning experience is sugarcoating it, because we've had to learn how to do. And it's been, of course, a learning experience to really dig. Really an exercise, I like to say, an exercise to really dig in for the truth and to try to access the stories that need to be told, because as Anna said, you can't just go up to someone and, come 2 feet apart and really have that human connection, whether it's through Zoom, through phone calls, through coming up with, hooking on mics to sticks that are 7 or 10 feet long and holding them at a distance to, try to get some sound from people. So it's been a learning experience for all of us, but it's also reminded us of how important our job is. And to touch a little bit on what Anna said about the media, becoming to a lot of people the enemy, it just has added another layer of stress and also another layer trying to impede access, trying to impede us from doing the job that we do, but making us stronger in the process.
So as we continue, do we have Nicole Linsalata with us yet from WSBN? I'm not sure if she's with us yet.
Right here.
All right. Good morning, Nicole. So nice to have you. We were in Tallahassee together a couple of
Yes. And I'm looking forward to going back. I hope we can go back soon. Although I do wonder, because of all these challenges that we have, what it's going to be like to cover Tallahassee now, because I think the last time I saw you there, we didn't have all of these COVID restrictions. So, that's going to be yet another thing to try to figure out. So kind of bouncing off what Christian had to say, I just, by way of background, I actually worked in Tallahassee, started in Albany, Georgia, a very small town or small city rather. And when we talk about challenges now, I think maybe Anna, you might remember this, Christian, you may also to a certain degree, the days when we didn't have cell phones and trying to, when you were trying to stop at a payphone to set up an interview. So sometimes when we have almost the ease of doing a Zoom interview, I try to remember how those days were, or when all you had was a two-way radio to try to communicate with your news desk and try to go out and do a story completely blind because you didn't have social media and you didn't have a cell phone. So I think in some ways things have gotten, as much as difficult as the challenges are, sometimes we do have a lot more ease in trying to gather elements that we never would have been able, that we would not have had even 10 years ago, 15 years ago. The other thing that I think has also been a huge challenge, and I think Anna and Christian, you both kind of touched on this, is now this sense that we're the enemy. And you could be out doing just a story about a dog rescue, and you invariably will have someone come up and call you a liar or be very hostile. And whereas hostility toward us was always sort of a thing, never like it is now. And I think that's a huge challenge, because I really don't know anyone, who out and out tries to push a narrative in our business. I personally don't, and haven't met anyone in 30 years who goes out and tries to push a narrative. Yet that seems to be the perception of way too many people. So I think that that's constantly a challenge. And I think it's a challenge when you're interviewing people. And I think it's a challenge when you're writing your package to try to, do what you've always done, but always cognizant of the fact that somebody is going to watch you and say, oh, none of that is true. So I think no matter what the story is, none of that is true. So I think that's almost a bigger challenge than the technological things we faced in 2020, or the things in terms of being close to people and interviewing people face to face. As challenging as sometimes the logistics can be, I think the perception is an even bigger and more important one.
Thank you, Nicole. Yeah, and especially when you're dealing with so many logistical challenges, to have that on top of everything else, definitely difficult. So now Lecrae Mitchell is a campaign reporter for CBS News. Welcome.
Hi, everyone. Really excited to be here this morning and excited to be able to answer questions. As Anna just said, I was a campaign reporter for CBS News covering the 2020 presidential election. And as I'm sure you can imagine, because we all watched it and or covered it, it was quite the election year. It was filled with twists and turns that none of us saw coming, but that we all had to figure out how to adapt and adapt quickly. I started in this role back in 2019. So for the first part of the primary, the Democratic primary, when there were, I think it was 300 people running for president on the Democratic side. No, but there were a lot of different candidates. I was based in South Carolina, which was one of the first 4 early states where voting took place. It was really exciting because I was covering all the different candidates as they came through the state, filled with political rallies and doing interviews with the teams on the ground in these places. And most importantly, talking to the voters about the issues that were important. And we had been doing that for months. And in March of 2020, after Super Tuesday, we all were told to go home until we figured out what exactly was happening with this coronavirus that we were hearing about. And essentially, we ended up being home for a lot of 2020, like everyone else, trying to figure out how to stay on top of the news developments with the virus and the pandemic, with the politics, with the issues that were still important to people, but that were being exacerbated now because of this pandemic, with the protests, which weren't new because we've seen social political protests before, but obviously during an election year, it had a different layer of attention to it. And we had to figure out how to do all of this from our living rooms. And so it was quite the experience. And I can say that it was a learning experience, and I'm really excited today to be able to talk about how we were able to make that transition, how we were able to take Zoom interviews and still further our very important reporting on this issue, and how in the last months, as we geared up to the election, when we did finally get to go back out on the trail, what it looked like, what safety precautions we had to take, social distancing and temperature checks before we could cover political conferences, going to Trump rallies in those last days and figuring out how to stay safe when you were at a venue with thousands of people. It was all so much learning and so much juggling, but I'm excited that we get to talk a little bit about all of that today during this conversation. So thanks for being here and looking forward to your questions.
Thank you so much. And we have our first question from Lucas Figueroa from Christopher Columbus High School. What are some good sources for COVID-related info? First of all, the best source is the health department, of course, of your state. And then I want to say something else, because sometimes I was very shocked when I would, for example, post a story where I interviewed one time the chief doctor, head of intensive care of the Jackson Health System, giving warnings and giving the latest information on what was going on with COVID. And somebody in my social media put, oh, how much are they paying him to say that? And I was like, look who this doctor is. So I would find sometimes some other reporters, some other stations, just because maybe they were available in person versus Zoom interviewing, like any doctor. I'm saying, of course, all doctors have something to say, but I would always try to go for interview doctors from a major health system, an infectious disease specialist, somebody who's in charge of intensive care, somebody who has a really good, who's part of a known health system, a known organization, because I thought that would help maybe, because my with COVID, when COVID turned political, my thing was, don't believe me, believe them. These doctors are saving lives. These doctors are treating grandparents, parents. Listen to them, don't listen to me. So that brings me to the first story that I want to show you. It's in Spanish. I hope that most of you will understand, but if you don't understand, I think you'll see the emotion here. And I remember this doctor, her name is Dr. Lillian Abo from Jackson. When we didn't know anything about COVID, it was new to all of us. I remember that after a big press conference at Jackson, she gave us interviews on the side in Spanish. And she said, okay, a lot of people are going to get this virus. Some are going to get very sick. Some are going to die. For others, it's going to be like a bad cold. She gave us like the COVID in a nutshell interview. And I always remember her. It was like the first one-on-one interview I did. And then 9 months later, she got the first vaccine from a doctor, and she was so emotional about it. So I want to share the story with you. After 9 months of like daily COVID stories, this was one of my favorites.
¿Qué tal? Muy buenas tardes, les saludan Alejandra Molina
y Gloria Ordaz. Gracias por acompañarnos. Esta mañana el vicepresidente Mike Pence, ahí ven las imágenes, se vacunó en público contra el COVID-19, lo hizo catalogando la vacuna como un milagro médico.
Se espera que en cualquier momento la FDA apruebe el uso de emergencia de una segunda vacuna para combatir el virus, la vacuna desarrollada por la empresa Moderna.
Vamos a pasar en vivo con Ana Cuervo y más información del tema. Adelante, Ana.
Buenas tardes. En la misma semana que la Florida reporta 2 días seguidos 13,000 casos nuevos de coronavirus ayer y hoy. Las primeras vacunas contra el COVID-19 en Miami-Dade comenzaron aquí en el hospital Jackson. Hoy viernes preguntamos cómo les va después que el vicepresidente se vacunó ante las cámaras. Con este pinchazo se vacuna contra el coronavirus, el oficial electo de más alto rango hasta ahora en Estados Unidos. El vicepresidente Mike Pence recibió la primera dosis de la vacuna Pfizer junto a su esposa y el cirujano general de Estados Unidos. Creo que la historia marcará esta semana como el principio del final de la pandemia, afirmó el vicepresidente. Pero con el aumento en casos y personas ingresadas en los hospitales, todavía nos falta un largo camino. Médicos y empleados del sur de la Florida se vacunaron esta semana llenos de esperanza y también recordando las vidas que no pudieron salvar. En el caso de la doctora a cargo del Departamento de Enfermedades Infecciosas del Jackson, fue la de su propio tío.
Mi tío falleció y falleció empezando la pandemia, las últimas semanas de marzo. Yo estaba a cargo del equipo, pues estaba bajo su cuidado.
Nos habla de una pérdida muy fuerte para ella.
Mi tío fue médico, fue el director de la Escuela de Medicina de la Universidad Central de Venezuela, donde me gradué, fue mi primer mentor. Siempre fue un eje en nuestra familia y su falta es realmente pues insuperable. ¿Qué te puedo decir? Que es un orgullo poder saber que podemos evitar otras muertes.
Una encuesta entre los empleados del Jackson mostró que menos de la mitad estaban dispuestos a vacunarse. Eso ha cambiado.
Una hora después de que habíamos empezado ya a vacunar a todo el mundo a las 2 de la tarde, más de 200 empleados que habían dicho que no se querían vacunar en la encuesta cambiaron y dijeron sí me voy a vacunar.
Y están vacunando empleados con ciertas alergias también.
Si una persona tiene historia de alergia a cualquier inyectable o cuando hay inyectable, cualquier medicamento inyectable o alergia a cualquier vacuna, nosotros estamos consultando con nuestro alergólogo, inmunólogo y le decimos a esa persona que tiene que estar en observación 30 minutos, no solamente 15 minutos.
So we have another question from Christopher Columbus High School. Dominic Gatto, how has your life as a reporter changed because of COVID? Boy, has it. We have a roller station that the crews can't work in the same news vehicle. So I'm in my car and the photographer is in his car. First of all, we worked from home in the beginning. So I learned Zoom. We didn't know what Zoom was. And here we are. We learned to Skype. And then the first time that actually I went out to do an in-person interview, I swear ours was like 10-foot mic stand. And I interviewed a local commissioner. He had his daughter take a picture of us. And when I was live presenting my story, I got a text, hey, Anna, you made Only in Dade, which is a funny blog where they put like pictures. And the picture was like, it looked like I was holding like a huge fishing rod. And the message was, when you need to work, but you don't make enough money to catch the Rona. And I couldn't believe that picture went like viral. But so, you're carrying this heavy pole, trying to distance. And then every time that I would ask for an interview with a local official, okay, are you doing Zoom, Skype? Are you in person? What are you doing? But anyway, I want to, anybody else wants to share how has our lives changed working with COVID?
Well, we carry as you're talking about, we carry a boom pole. And so when we do the in-person interviews, we try to stay back as far as we can, and a very sort of nitty-gritty detail is sometimes sound with masks. Sometimes it's hard to understand people. It's harder to get a clear soundbite. I mean, that's just like a very basic level logistical issue. So sometimes we try to stand far enough away where they can feel comfortable taking their mask off to answer questions. And a lot of times I feel better about that because then I know that it's not sometimes depending on the mask, it can be a very garbled sound. So, there's that. But I think as long as you're farther away, you're fine. We do the same thing with the cars, although we do have times when we're in the same car. We also work with the same photographer most of the time. I've worked with the same photographer now every day, save maybe 3 days in the last year. And so, we're always, together. And have traveled together. And that's been another issue. There have been travel stories to DC and you're on a plane. And we noticed on one trip to DC, the airline literally had us packed like this. We thought this can't be good.
Right.
So there's that. There was another question, though, I noticed that was right before Dominic's about how do you face the fear of going out into the field while facing the risk of infection? We try to limit that in terms of also not doing interview. And Anna and Christian, used to go and do a story and you knock on a door and then go inside their living room and set up a light and do an interview. We really don't do that anymore.
Or even go ahead, Nicole.
No, go
yeah,
ahead.
just like what was it, Thursday night? We were covering a visual, and in the past we would be right up in the middle of it, doing interviews with family members. And the way things are now, you need to keep your distance and hope or call and maybe try to get an interview or get someone to come out of the crowd. But all the reporters. We were standing some 20 feet away from the crowd because you just can't take that chance.
And it doesn't, don't you feel like it loses something in terms of, especially in an emotional story, it does lose some of that intimacy. So we try to not have that floating mic, around them and try to shoot it a little tighter. So at least it preserves some of just that. So you're not seeing big boom poles, but that's difficult. And in a story like that, you want it to be emotional and intimate. You don't want it to look like some big,
I think early on in the pandemic, part of facing the fear was just making sure that you had as much information as possible as well. I remember the first time that I went back out into the field, we had to make sure that I got a coronavirus test before I left my home. Once I got to the location of the interview, I had to quarantine a few days before actually covering the story. And so that was another way that things changed, because now you were having to factor in days of testing and quarantining before actually getting out into the field and actually asking questions. But in terms of facing that fear, I think, at the end of the day, you have to go with your gut. As a student journalist, if something doesn't feel like it's safe, if you feel like you're in a space that there are too many people or not enough people are wearing masks, you have to be smart and use common sense in some of these situations to make sure that you're keeping yourself safe. In those situations where I would be at huge Trump rallies, we would use the long boom mics, as all of the panelists here have mentioned. But if I was in a crowd and I'm trying to grab people to interview and I feel like too many people are around me, I would back up out of the way. I would try to find people that were trying to space out a little bit and social distance. So definitely, in terms of facing those fears, make sure you have all the information you can about an area. Before I would go to a location, when former President Trump had a rally in Macon, before I got there, how many cases does Macon have? What are some of the stats for that area? Where's the nearest place to get a coronavirus test once I get there? And where are some of the, some of the places where I could get medical assistance if needed? So doing that research so that you're well informed before you get to a place, but then also using common sense once you're in that space and on the ground, I think is very important.
I wanted to make a point, since you spoke about research and the previous question about sourcing. I think we have all been reminded with this New York Governor Andrew Cuomo story and his nebulous actions with not releasing or being totally clear about the number of cases in senior homes. Even if we're getting figures and information from the state, it's important to dig deeper into those figures, even if they are accurate. Like Anna said, going to doctors and experts and helping give those figures and those numbers context. And on that note, one thing that I think we all should have done a little bit better throughout the pandemic at the same time that we're showing the number of cases and people that have died, it's important to also show the number of people that have recovered. So people have better context of what the situation is. So, for students that are working on projects looking towards the future, always remember to question and dig deeper into numbers that you get from authorities.
Thank you so much. Now let's take a look at Lecrae's video, see how she covered the campaign trail in the middle of this pandemic.
Hi everyone, I'm Lecrae Mitchell and I'm a campaign reporter for CBS News covering the 2020 election. Today I am getting prepared to be the unilateral producer for a Trump rally in the Villages, Florida. It's a huge retirement community here. Right now I've been asked to go and get interviews with some of the seniors that live in this community for one of the broadcasts.
I was born in a stolen ice cream truck. Mama was jonesing for some rocky road and wasn't taking no for an answer.
That is so much of what our job entails sometimes. Getting requests, going out, shooting videos. So I'm going to take my camera now.
If you want to be on TV, you have to be in front of the camera. Oh, I get it!
But I wanted to show you my workstation for today, which is my rental car. This is where I will be doing some of the work before we head inside for the event.
Even from the dozen of voters that I spoke to today, Elaine, it's evident that you can see that people who are supporting former Vice President Joe Biden, they always cite his experience working as Vice President with President Barack Obama. They say they want to go back to a time that felt more civil, a time where the country felt a bit more united. And those exit polls also show where 31% of North Carolina voters say that the most important candidate quality for them is someone who can unite the country.
Thank you, Lecrae, for sharing that video with us. I love the way you keep it lighthearted, right?
Yes.
Working from a car all over the country can't be easy.
No, it's not. And you don't get a lot of sleep and you're trying to eat healthy, but it's very hard to do that in some places. So I think, at the end of the day, though, we all knew that we had a really important job, which was to keep voters as informed as we could about where candidates stood on the issues that were important to them. Healthcare, handling the pandemic, obviously became a huge thing. Which candidate was going to be passionate about raising minimum wage for labor workers? And so I think for us, the responsibility of getting accurate reporting out about those important issues outweighed sometimes the taxing, the toll that it takes on your body, being awake so much and moving around so much. We had a huge goal that we wanted to accomplish.
I think you answered. Student Alexis Vivanco had a question: how the changing political climate affect the way you report? No, you had not answered that one. He had a previous question about keeping yourself safe in the field, which you answered with the risk of infection. He has another question: how will the changing political climate affect the way you report? And I think, this is about reputable reporting. I think our challenge is to keep our reporting balanced and keep ourselves reputable despite everything else going on around us, right?
Well, I think some people might read that question, hear that question, and think about how hard we all went on the Trump campaign and politicians and fact checking them. And I think that there's this notion that for whatever reason, we're not going to be as hard on politicians or this new administration. And the answer to that question should be, it shouldn't change it at all. We need to be as hard, as tough on this administration as we were with the last one.
I couldn't agree more with what Christian just said. My immediate first response to that was, it should not change. You should still be putting in the same amount of time to fact check. You should still be bringing the same amount of, being sober about any information that you receive and not taking the first answer you get, triple checking and quadruple checking any fact that you have in a script, having multiple sources on that none of that should change, no matter the presidential administration or no matter who is in the office of the presidency. But I will say, in terms of political climate, sort of how divisive and how, you know, tense and hyper partisan things are, it does feel like we have trended to this, you know, this atmosphere that feels a lot more divisive in that way. And I think the way that you make sure that your reporting stays accurate in that is that you're being very careful how you say things, right? When I write any piece of script, I'm thinking, is this sentence alone, is it fair? Is it balanced? Did I use an adjective that actually makes something seem more or less than just balanced? So I think there is a greater level of scrutiny that comes with covering this more, what seems to be a more hyper-partisan environment. Because it's very easy to do, right? You see something happen, a politician makes a move, and as a human, your first thought is, no one thinks that's okay. But as a journalist, my thought is, it's not my job to editorialize this. It's my job to tell you what was done, and then you decide how you feel about that move. So more scrutiny, I would say, but yeah.
Nicole, being local, since, I mean, I know you're part of this community, we have a question from Edward Franco from Ferguson Senior High School in Miami. How do you deal with viewers who respond differently when you're reporting the truth? I say this because we're local, we're part of this community, and our viewers are our neighbors, right?
Yeah, I'm going to be completely honest. That is a battle because I get really not happy when, you know, when people come up to you and immediately accuse you of, for example, there was a rally on the corner of a street corner in Fort Lauderdale several months ago. And when we first arrived, and we weren't covering necessarily the rally, but we were covering an event that had happened. Somebody had fired like a BB or something near the rally. And so a woman got, you know, hit in the shoulder. And as soon as we got out of the car, you know, hey, you know, and being polite and saying, hey, do you know, can we talk to somebody who saw what happened? Well, not if you're going to not tell the story right. And I immediately have a problem myself, and I'm being completely honest, with that level of in my face instant aggression. I would like to come on here and say, you know, I say, oh, you know, I understand completely. I personally have to count to 10 because it is really frustrating when you know that you're sitting in your car with the video, and as Lecrae said, you are parsing every word trying to be fair. Yes. And you are second guessing yourself to a degree, saying, wait, now if I say it like this, or you say to your photographer, you say to your EP, hey, if I say it like this, does it sound like this? I called my EP, I called my news director yesterday about a line in the story where I said, please tell me if this sounds snarky. So they have no idea that we are asking other people, we are actually parsing it. And we are thinking about it, and to have that in your face aggression, like that you gave it no thought, that you already have a narrative. So to Edward's question, I wish I could say I was a better person than that, but I do have to count to 10 and try to explain to them nicely that we're just here to find out what happened. Right. I'm not here to attack you. I'm not here to make you look like X, Y, or Z. You will do that on your own. I am just here to find out what happened. And I have seen other reporters who probably do handle that better than I do. But I personally have to say, this is what we're here for. So maybe Christian, how do you handle it?
Listen, was it a couple of weeks ago, the grocery store in Naples with the owner that hasn't enforced mask wearing throughout the whole pandemic. We went there to do a story on that, and oh my God, like going into that grocery store and it was packed with people. As soon as I came out, my EP was like, hey, make sure you get tested in a couple of days. But the thing with that story is, you know, once we came out, I did my live shot wearing a mask, because if I can't control the people around me or where I'm at, because we're in the parking lot, so there's people, and by the way, people in Naples are super nice. So everyone was saying hello, then jumping into, you better report this the right way and you better do your research. 2 weeks, 3 weeks since that story, I'm still getting emails from people accusing me of propaganda and not doing my own research, and you should be ashamed of yourself. And a good rule would be not to respond to any emails or tweets about that. I can't help myself sometimes. Last night I replied to one email. I try not to reply to all of them, but you almost at first I get angry, but then ultimately I feel terrible that some people are believing the misinformation out there. And I try to be as nice as possible in my reply, not necessarily fuel divisiveness. But yeah, it's case by case scenario, and it's hard. It's hard to keep your cool.
I'd like to show Nicole video now because I'd like to show your video now, Nicole, because it shows how hard you do work to get the real story out there and what the real message that people want to share. So let's look at that video now during the protests over the summer.
Well, Belkis, we are right in the middle of the northbound lanes of 441. I'm going to step out of the way so you can watch and see what's going on. They are naming the names of some of those who have died at the hands of police in the last several months, several years. And I have to tell you, this crowd here has been actually gathered at this spot telling some very compelling stories. We spoke to a family with 2 young children from Lauderhill who felt like they just had to bring their young children here to explain to them. Said that they have had to explain to their children what happened to George Floyd, especially those with sons. They've had to explain why this sort of thing happens. And one woman told me, she said, my son who's 8, I've had to tell him he doesn't have the choice or he doesn't have the opportunity to make even one mistake. Then one mistake could be deadly. That's what she's telling her 8-year-old. And that is why she is here taking part in this march here in Davie, now walking toward Griffin Road.
I was so moved when I saw these clips, Nicole, because as students also, as you watch this, notice that she's not saying they're marching down the street, they're on their knees, they're in silence. That's obvious. But I love the way that you shared what these parents say to their children. And every community can relate to that. So I thought that was a great way to share what is behind these protests, what is the pain that these people are feeling. And I wonder if you did that on purpose, try to get really to the nuts and bolts of what was behind the protest, and not just all the perhaps with the visuals and whether the streets are being blocked, but really to get to the pain, what they're feeling.
Yeah, because I think that those obvious things we actually see all the time in a lot of these stories, not even just protest stories, but in, a car accident, the car is on fire, the road is blocked. Okay, well, yeah, we see that. I had a photographer once who really drilled this into me in Atlanta. He was great. He was a little crazy, but he was great because he told me, he said, don't be so literal. He said, let me handle that with my video. And yes, you will always learn, especially as students, to write to video, and you do that. But because you see a dog crossing the street, you don't have to say, and a dog crossed the street. You can say something like, whatever the situation is without just writing so literally. And I think when it comes to a rally or any event like this with a group, even if it's a family that's searching for a missing child or people are raising money for a cause, I kind of sometimes think about them at home watching it after they met you and you interviewed them. And I'm not saying you have to always make them happy, because they're not necessarily always going to be happy with your story, but you want to get across why they're doing what they're doing. Why are these people walking in the middle of Griffin Road? Why are they there? Well, that's why they're there. And I think for the people who are not there, who might wonder, oh, why are these people blocking traffic? Or if it's a Trump rally, why are these people all gathered like this? What is it that brings them, to that point to feel so strongly about it? Well, that's why we're there, is to tell you why they're there.
Absolutely.
And so I think trying to find the thing that's not obvious to the person at home, because isn't that the point of us being there, is to tell the people who aren't there?
I think that
another way, oh, go ahead, Amy.
Rally after rally, right? There were so many, there were so many rallies day after day. And when you make them different that way, when you're sharing those stories, I think that makes a big difference.
I think another thing to keep in mind too, when you're covering protests is exactly what Nicole just said about not being obvious. And I think sometimes that means going outside of talking to just the people who are at the protests as well. One of the things about being home a lot of the summer during the pandemic and during the George Floyd protests, I found myself really struggling in the beginning with how do you tell this story if you can't physically be there at some of these protests? And one of the ways I did that was I ended up writing a piece where I spoke with all of these faith leaders that were from Ferguson, that were from some of the cities that had seen protests like this before, to sort of give historical context on what this means. But what I think was interesting about that story was, although I wasn't talking to people who were in the streets, and asking them why they were there, I was talking to the community members who are obviously also impacted, who have been impacted by this in past rallies, about what made this particular instance different, if it was different. Why should we believe that this was gonna have a different outcome than the others? And you have people who have lived in these communities telling you what feels different this time. Telling me, normally, Lecrae, this is a 5-day thing. This has been going on for 2 months. Something's different. Normally, Lecrae, this is just encapsulated in the city where the offense took place. This time, we're seeing protests across the world. This is different. And so I think talking to community members who may not be on site is a way to get at it too, sometimes when you're trying to cover protests. And the other thing I'll say, just because I really wanted a chance to answer the question of how do you respond to people who feel differently when you're reporting the truth, I would just say that it's important when you're meeting people to take into account that the way people feel about media, the way people feel about you, whether it's because of how you look or how you sound, is based off of their personal life experiences. The same way that we have our own life experiences and events that have happened to us that dictate how we perceive the world, it dictates what I like to call our lens. They have that too. And I think anytime I would meet people who felt aggressive against media before they got to know me, I would start with just a conversation. I would tell my camera guys, let's wait a second, no camera for this, no boom mic for this. Let me just talk to this woman from Ohio who has been listening to reports for months now that all media is fake news. Let me just talk to her on a human level, about why I'm here and what I want to hear from her. And I find that the people who are the most angry when they first meet me, if I can just get a couple sentences in where they can see the humanness in me, where they can see the sincerity in me, just the curiosity, the pure curiosity, that really does disarm people more than you would think, actually.
And to that point, everybody wants to be listened to.
Yes.
Everybody wants to be listened to. It doesn't matter how much they hate you. And then half of those people want to have a voice, want to speak out. They want to be interviewed. They may be mad at you, call you fake news, but even with some of these post-election Trump rallies, they hate you, but they want you there.
They want to be heard.
They want to be heard, they want to be seen, and they know that they can be seen through your lens. And so that's another thing to, also remind yourself that you're not going out to a protest or a story to be liked. That's not our job. Our job is to gather information, deliver that information, give these people the opportunity to be heard. That's it.
I think Lecrae and Kristen, you've answered a bit. Edward from Ferguson High School, his question was, how do you handle all the different emotions coming from these stories? Has it been a mental struggle? And I think you did answer that in recognizing that these people's emotions comes from their life experience. And
Yeah.
recognizing that, I think, also makes it a little bit easier on me to have a little bit more of that patience and to not get so angry and to go on with my job as a journalist, right?
I think I couldn't agree more with you, Anna. And I think Edward's question is so important because it's very easy as a reporter. We're so busy going, telling the next story. Sometimes we don't stop and sit in what we're covering. And I remember vividly during the summer, I had a moment where after days of covering the George Floyd protests, I was on one of our morning political calls, and I just broke down. And I did not even realize I was just talking, and all of a sudden I just started blubbering and crying. And my bosses talked to me after, and they were all so sympathetic and empathetic. But what that reminded me, Edward, was that we're humans too. We're reporters, but we're human beings who feel, who see our own family members in the stories that we're covering, who see ourselves sometimes in the stories that we're covering. And I think an important part of covering these stories, in an accurate way, but also taking yourself into account, is giving yourself that break sometimes. Sometimes you got to take that day. You got to take that day where you can't look at the news. You got to turn off your notifications, and you've got to just unplug, because
disconnect.
It'll build up and it comes out.
I was definitely there a couple of times during the past year and some. Now I'd like to share, Christian, your video, because it shows another challenge we face here in South Florida, which is a great challenge. We live in such a great multi-ethnic society, and sometimes you have the big job of bringing a certain community's plight to your audience, right? And they might know nothing about Puerto Rico and why these people are so upset. So let's take a look at that clip.
Calvin, you can feel the anticipation, you can feel the tension. We have our photojournalist, Danny Diaz, up on a balcony to try to do this crowd some justice. Go ahead and take a look here. We're talking thousands of people. We were told by the governor's spokesperson earlier today that the governor would be making an announcement sometime tonight. That has not happened, and so here we are. This is the 12th night of protests following the leak of those text messages that were so offensive and so profane. But for so many of these Puerto Ricans, this isn't just about the chats. It's about corruption. It's about what the people of this island have been through since Hurricane Maria. They demand new leadership, and the governor has refused to step down. We literally bumped into a man and a woman who flew here from Miami to join this protest. Take a listen.
We're tired, but we came in sneakers. We came in clothes that don't make us hot, because we'll wait here all night, all day, all week, all month if we have to, till he gets the hell out.
First of all, I want to clear up, that was pre-pandemic, right?
Yeah. So I purposely wanted to share something that wasn't within the past year, because we will get through this pandemic, and there will be other times when it's going to be tough to do some reputable reporting. And that was, of course, the weeks-long protests in Puerto Rico, where, you had hundreds, thousands of people every night going out to protest. There was violence. Someone before we started the meeting was asking about whether we've ever worn bulletproof vests. During those protests, every night after our 11 o'clock live shot, we put on our riot gear because there were several nights, one night in particular, where we essentially had to be rescued by police because of the Molotov cocktails that were being thrown, bricks, rocks. I mean, it was ugly. And so a couple of things that I think that I'd like for students to take away and keep in mind for future reference is the importance to first be safe, and second, flexibility. And that has been really important also throughout the pandemic. Being flexible, not going into a situation or a story, trying to, go into it with a certain idea of how the story is going to be. Sometimes you arrive at a protest and your story morphs into something else. And that's something that we had to do every night when we went out and covered these protests, because we knew what it was about and why people were there. But every night it was something different, and we had to kind of, listen, watch and see how things developed, especially when you're dealing with such a huge crowd like that would grow from a few hundred to several thousand every night.
What kind of response did you get from your audience, I wonder? Because Local 10 might have obviously some Puerto Rican community lives here in Miami, but did you have interest? Did you have curiosity as far as what kind of response did you get, I wonder?
I think that because of what happened with Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico, there was almost in South Florida, there almost came this empathy towards the island and what happened in the island, the people of the island. And so when these protests broke out, it was like, are you kidding me? Something else? These people just went through 2 years of hell with Hurricane Maria, and now they're it's like self-destruction. And so there was certainly that interest there. But that was, very specific to South Florida. I have friends, Puerto Rican friends across the country that wanted to go and cover those protests and just, couldn't, because it wasn't of interest to their viewers. But in South Florida, we certainly have that. And it's, obviously because of our makeup, right? And that's one of the reasons, I often joke around that Channel 10 thinks it's like a mini CNN, because they love to send people places and travel. But there is that interest. We do have that interest in South Florida, as to what's happening in Colombia, Venezuela, other parts of Central America, and of course Puerto Rico, and of course Cuba, and of course the Dominican Republic, and of course Haiti. So certainly we do see that interest, and we do get questions all the time about what's going on in those places.
One of my favorite classes I went to FIU it was only one credit. One of my favorite classes was on Saturdays, covering a multi-ethnic society. And then he put a bunch of different communities up on the board. And it was like, oh, I'm going to cover Little Havana. I live 5 minutes from there. I know that place. It was like, you're covering Goulds and Richmond Heights. And he kind of crisscrossed us, knowing our backgrounds. And it's like, go out there with an open mind. And I did it with a local barber. And it was such a great experience. Like you said, but don't go with a certain idea, go with an open mind. And I think I still find myself doing that sometimes when I go to a different community. And that's great advice to the students. Go with an open mind and find, talk to people and get to know someone. Just, a common person, just anybody, a neighbor can get an older, sometimes, that has maybe been the leader of a family, can tell you so much about a community and their plight when they've been through. So now I'd like you to share your final thoughts on how do you keep reputable, you're reporting solid during so many different challenges coming from every direction, from keeping healthy and safe to being called fake news, to being called the enemy. What else has been happening? To covering, protests, in the middle of a pandemic, so many different challenges. How have you kept your reporting reputable? Final thoughts on this. Who wants to go first?
I was just going to say, I think sticking to the basics that we've all been taught. Is it fair? Is it accurate? Is it in the proper context, right? Have we given it the context that it needs for something to make sense? And a lot of times that means going back into history and seeing what has happened up until that moment. To the thing that you're covering. I saw one of the questions was, how, as a high school student, can you tell a story and make it reputable when sometimes people don't see you as a legit organization? Well, I'd argue that even sometimes when you work for a network, when you work for CBS News, you're still trying to find yourself explaining to someone your legitimacy, especially if they have bias against media as a whole. So I would say, I would give you the same advice that I'd give any of my colleagues now, which is, keeping it fair, keeping it honest, accurate, contextualizing it, but more importantly, to a point that I started on earlier, which is making sure that, everything that makes you goes into how you're telling a story too. You're not just covering the pandemic, you're living the pandemic. You weren't just watching these protests. You too were having to figure out how you felt about the things that people were angry about. And, you're still a human in all of the things that you're covering. And I would just implore that as a student journalist, as a journalist, after you graduate from high school, just remember to keep that humanness in your stories. When you're covering something that's sad, a shooting, a fire where people have lost everything, it's not just that these people have lost their homes. It's that the importance of needing shelter. The importance of needing some place to go home at night to feel safe. And I think that sort of humanness should come out in any story that you're telling, because it's the difference between you just reporting on something that's happening behind you, like a building going up in flames and sounding really bare or really standard and reporterish about it, or sounding like a human who has empathy. And being empathetic, I think, will take you a long way. That's something that I think should be with you now as a student journalist, and something you keep with you, being empathetic in your stories.
I think that is huge that you said that, because I have had this conversation with others. And I think especially as students, sometimes I've kind of wondered if that has to come with experience and time and life experience. But I think as a student, if you always keep that in mind, that, yeah, I might only be X number of years old, I may not have had kids yet. So when the baby, I can't, like in Texas, I don't have water to make baby formula. It may not be something that you personally have ever felt that emotion. So if you can, as a younger person who's not gone through this stuff, if you can kind of always keep that at top of mind, you'll be that much further ahead.
Absolutely.
And just say, okay, I know I've never had this kind of issue before, or I've never been a mom or a dad who worried about the safety of my kid when I can't turn the heat on. But if you think about that ahead of time, that will be huge for making your stories that much better.
Couldn't agree more.
I guess to that point, don't try to tell your story like someone else would, or how you think someone else would, or like some other reporter that you like tells their story on TV. Right. Tell the story, be you while you're telling your story, and I think that speaks to being human. No one else is going to be able to tell the story the way you do, because it's you gathering the information, you asking the questions, you really personalizing the story from your perspective. And listen, you're young, your perspective is going to be of a younger person telling that story. And to a certain extent, that's okay. And that's you, and that's your style. So that also, if preparation, right? You want to prepare, you want to be informed as to what's happening. You want to know what the latest number of cases are. But preparation also involves being healthy, trying to get enough sleep, having your mask. If you aren't prepared and if you aren't safe, you may get sick and you may not be able to do your job. So that's also really, really important. Make sure that you are in a healthy place, physically and mentally, so you can give it your 200%. And also, keeping it to the basics: who, what, when, where, and why. Always question, always remember that you're there to do a job. And that job is to, question the information that you get and report the news. Don't give your opinion, just report the news.
Thank you, Nicole, Kristen, Lecrae, for that great advice. And as you do that job and you do it well, always remember that you can't please everyone. And you have to be at peace with yourself that you did the best job possible. Thank you so much for tuning in, for participating. We hope you got something out of this. And if you have any questions that remained unanswered, here is our information. Feel free to reach out to us. If you have any questions that came to mind afterwards, we would love to connect with you also on our social media. And we would love you to save the date for our next webinar, social media, a great topic, how to use it to cut through the noise with content that attracts, engages, and builds your brand. It may even be a career choice. So social media, very, very important in this day and age in journalism. So thank you so much for tuning in. Have a great weekend, and we'll look for you in our next